Welcome to the 11th presentation in the series where we're working our way through the prophecies of Ezekiel. I've entitled this presentation, What About the Other People Groups? As usual, let's just reflect back on where we've been. Ezekiel, a young priest, called by God to be a prophet, one who declares the mind of God in a specific situation, what God thinks about what is happening. He was one of the group that was deported to Babylon from Jerusalem in 597 BC. He was a young married man, 25 years of age. He was speaking to these deportees, they were largely drawn from the leadership class of that time in Jerusalem. Speaking, well, he was limited. Much of his speaking was enactment, things he did to communicate. But these deportees, the leaders of the past, they refused to listen. They weren't going to get it. Now in the book, chapters 1 to 24, the focus of Ezekiel here is God giving insights into the fate of Jerusalem and Judah. The deportees felt that God would rescue the city, rescue the nation, put things back to where they were, and all their cozy power positions would be restored. No, that's not what God's going to do. And Ezekiel showed that the fall of the nation would happen, the city would be destroyed, the temple would be razed to the ground, and deportation to Babylon would follow. Now this presentation is the first in a series where we're looking at the prophetic judgments, the insights from God, what God's saying about what's going to happen to the other people groups round about and their rulers. Where do they fit into God's plans? The final section of the book, things had now happened. Babylon had overrun the land. The city had fallen, the temple had been flattened. Now, what's the future for God's people? They seem to have lost everything. But we'll leave that to future presentations. Now he was speaking to the exiles, the deportees drawn from the leadership classes of 597. This was classic Babylonian policy. When they conquered a land, they took out the top people, took them back to Babylon. They often employed them to do good things. But it broke the leadership and it broke the power for revolt and rebellion amongst conquered peoples. There's our three sections of the book. This leadership class, that's the prophecies were addressed to them. They couldn't get it. They had brought the disasters on themselves. And they were simply unwilling to understand what God was doing. The bit of the section of the book we're going to look at now, addressed to the leadership classes who were deported to Babylon. They still saw themselves as superior. After all, we're God's chosen people. They misunderstood the whole question and nature of choice. God only chooses for a purpose, a task, not because somebody's superior. As a result, they looked down on the neighbouring people groups. They were not the chosen people. Now, what's God saying about them? We're going to look at that. Jerusalem, the news came through. It took a while to get through. Communications in those days were by people having to travel. Jerusalem had been conquered, sacked, temple flattened, their whole world collapsed, and suddenly they realized that what Ezekiel was saying was true. But that raises the question in their minds. Was there any future for the people of God? They seem to have lost everything. That's what Ezekiel showed, often by enacting it out. These exiles were resistant to listening. And God was going to allow it. He wasn't going to step in and magically solve all the problems that they had created themselves. These leadership groups had lived for their own benefit, and they'd exploited the population to line their own pockets. And there was corruption and the abuse of others all across the nation, the people group of Judah. Corroded the whole nation's strength. It was in no fit state to withstand the onslaught from any enemy. The political leadership, the religious leadership, and the legal leadership were all in it together. And the whole nation's structure and culture was falling apart. But you see, that's the problem. They were God's people. And God's reputation was tied up with the behavior of his people. And God's reputation was being dragged through the mud. They brought it on themselves. That's what the temple had become, and we just want to stop and think for a moment into the 21st century. How often our religious buildings, artifacts, rituals and events have become an idolatrous source of cultural pride. See, that's God's priority, and that's kind of religious language to develop a sanctified people. Put it into straightforward language. God's priority is to develop his people who were living out the way of Jesus, I speak in modern terms, before the watching world. Stop for a minute and think of our churches and Christian groups today. To what extent are we living out the way of Jesus? Are we being faithful to all that what he said and did and commanded? You see, religious rituals and performance are not God's priority. Indeed, it's worse. They can easily undermine God's priority. And that's what had happened in Judah, and tragically, we're seeing exactly the same thing happening across all our churches today. There are great parallels between what Ezekiel was seeing and what's happening in the 21st century. Now let's move forward. We're going to look at chapters 25 onwards. We have to remember this was addressed to the exiles. He's speaking about the other people groups that surrounded the land of Judah, but he's not speaking to them. He's speaking to the leadership classes who had been deported to Babylon a few years previous. They saw themselves as superior. They saw themselves as God's chosen people. They looked down the neighbouring people groups. And too often, this has happened today amongst God's people. Now, these people groups were enemies of Judah, and they were seeking her downfall. They wanted the pickings of the land. They wanted the wealth. They wanted the produce. Ezekiel sees that God's coming to put things right. But what was going to happen to these people groups is related to the future of what was going to happen to the people of Judah, God's people, which is the theme of the last part of the book of Ezekiel. There's a central theme that underpins it all. God rules the affairs of all people groups. There's no chosen in-group that he gives favours to. And God will deal fairly with all people groups. And that theme underpins all that Ezekiel was understanding and recording for us. Now let's look at a map to see the context of it. We're at the right-hand end of the Mediterranean Sea as you look at the map. Egypt in the bottom left-hand corner. Judah and Israel were once one country. God's people broke in two. How much have we seen that going on in the centuries down through the years? Israel had been wiped out by Assyria. It had ceased to exist as a separate entity, leaving Judah, the minority group in the south, with the capital Jerusalem, which was approximately central in the whole land when Israel and Judah were one. Now there were people groups to the east, Ammon, Moab, Edom. They were largely desert people groups, and they continually harried Judah and Israel before that because they wanted the produce of the land. They depended on oasis and trade, and when things were tough, they came in and stole things. On the western side, Philistia, and then Tyre and Sidon, which was the Phoenician people group, and Tyre and Sidon are two of the cities. And the whole people group is often just labelled after these two cities. Now Philistia, they continually tried to infiltrate into Judah, take over a bit of land, bit of property, steal a few things. Tyre and Sidon were trading centres, and they had a lot of wealth and the power that comes from it. In those days, wealth came from agriculture or trade or both. And Tyre particularly was the trading capital of the whole of the eastern Mediterranean. Now Egypt, it had been a major power broker of the region in the past. The great Egyptian empire had ruled for millennia. In fact, the whole area here was once ruled by Egypt. It was weakening, but periodically it tried to recapture something of its past glories. Then there was Babylon, coming from far away to the northeast. And it was an empire that just wanted to expand itself, take over more, rule more peoples, power, money. It had a very short-lived life, but it expanded very efficiently during that time. Now there's some puzzling features of this section. We don't find anywhere here any prophecy addressed to describe what's going to happen to Babylon. Edom is mentioned, but briefly, because there's a further mention in chapter 35, which we'll return to when we get there. But there's an enormous amount said about Tyre and about Egypt. Now, if we look at Babylon, Jeremiah had already devoted 2 chapters of his book to what was going to happen to Babylon. Jeremiah realized that Babylon was the agent of God's judgment, God putting things right in Judah, but itself would be judged because of its violent and brutal behavior. There are other countries mentioned. Edom is mentioned, chapter 35, and then northerly nations known as Gog, dealt with in chapters 38 and 39. We'll come to them later. The reason why there's such a great length here is that these were the 2 main groups that were resisting Babylon. Once Judah had been taken, they were the 2 groups that posed problems. Now we've got to remember these prophecies were given by Ezekiel revealing what God thought of the situation. They were given to the leaders of the exiles, and they relate directly to the situation at that time. We've got to interpret it in that context. Back to our map. We're going to start off by looking at these ones. Just a summary. Nebuchadnezzar spared Ammon and went for Jerusalem instead, but the country was later overrun by desert tribes. Moab had a history of refusing to recognize the people of God, Yahweh, at all, and it was later overrun by desert tribes. Persistent skirmishes between Judah and previously Israel as well, and Edom. And when the people from Judah, the Israelites, were fleeing from Jerusalem, Edom stopped them, handed them over to the Babylonians, where they'd be tortured and killed. Their land was later conquered, and as a people group they were wiped out. Philistia tried to destroy the Israelite nation when it was one nation. The people group was overrun by Babylonia and absorbed, disappeared from history. Now there are two themes captured in these phrases. You will know that I am the Lord. These people groups would then have to recognize that God, Yahweh, the Lord, the God of the people of Judah, He was in control. Then there's this strange phrase in various forms, you will know my vengeance. Now we've got to remember the word vengeance doesn't quite capture the meaning that we have in modern English today. These neighbouring groups all served their own gods. They lost out completely. They disappeared. They were wiped out from history, absorbed. God's people group, the people of Judah, went on. They survived as an entity, were re-established. God is the sovereign Lord of the world. Now the religions of the neighbouring people groups led them into all kinds of evils, all kinds of brutality, including temple prostitution and child sacrifice. The word vengeance carries the idea God coming to put things right. It's not God angry in any retaliatory or brutal sense. God's coming to straighten things out, and it will be uncomfortable. So we've just got to watch. The original word in the original language isn't quite the same as the word vengeance in English. Put it into the modern culture of today, that's what is happening in our Western societies. All religions are regarded as equal, and if the leaders of our societies are honest, they would say equally irrelevant. But there's a positive attempt to seek the downfall of the people of God. And many people are saying, we reject what you stand for, and we're passing laws to undermine it. Throughout the world today, there are many who are living for power and control over others. A tragic human characteristic. Sometimes can be an individual leader with delusional power of grandeur. Sometimes it can be a whole nation or people group or religious entity. But many today in the world are living for wealth and material success, and we've got corrupted by that in the West. But you can see it in the Islamic world. Oil is seen as Allah's gold. And they see the wealth that they have accumulated and the rich lifestyles that are open to them because of that wealth as a sign of Allah's favour. But you also see it in the totalitarian leaders of the world, where they're just living for the power, wealth and success that they can accumulate for themselves. So what Ezekiel was seeing here, still happening today. And that's the point he's making. But always, in Old Testament thought, God is always seen in ultimate control. Now there's a very important balance point here. What Ezekiel was seeing is God has an overall plan, purpose and destiny for the benefit of all human beings. But each of us is free to become part of that or go our own way. But remember, actions have consequences. If we go our own way, then the consequences will follow as night follows day. We lose out on all the best that God has for us in His plan, purpose and destiny. Now that is true at a national level, people group level, community level, or individual level. But we've got to retain the balance. If we focus too much on the left, we end up with fatalism. None of us has any responsibility. God's decided it all in advance. If we go too much to the right, then we think we're free to do whatever we want, and we can plan the future, and God will fit in with that. And there's a bit of that has crept into our churches and Christian groups. We've got to maintain the balance. And Ezekiel has got it. Now, a few bits from chapter 25. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, set your face against the Ammonites and prophesy against them. Say to them, hear the word of the sovereign Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Because you said, aha, over my sanctuary when it was desecrated, and over the land of Israel when it was laid waste, and over the people of Judah when they went into exile. Therefore I'm going to give you to the people of the east as a possession. I will destroy you, and you will know that I am the Lord. They rubbed their hands with glee when Israel was flattened and Judah followed. They lost out to the desert people overrunning them. Actions have consequences. This is what the sovereign Lord says, because Moab and Seir said, look, Judah's become like all the other nations. Back to the same thing, all religions are equal. Therefore I will expose the flank of Moab. I will give Moab along with the Ammonites to the people of the east as possession, so the Ammonites will not be remembered among the nations. Then they will know that I am the Lord. Actions have consequences. This is what the sovereign Lord says, because Edom, to the south, took revenge on Judah and became very guilty by doing so. Therefore this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will stretch out my hand against Edom, and they will know my vengeance. God putting it right, declares the sovereign Lord. Actions have consequences. This is what the sovereign Lord says, because the Philistines acted in vengeance and took revenge with malice in their hearts. In other words, it's defining the use of the word. And with ancient hostility sought to destroy Judah. Therefore this is what the sovereign Lord says. I'm about to stretch out my hand against the Philistines. Then they will know that I am the Lord when I take vengeance on them. Actions have consequences. The people, largely in the West today, but in the Islamic world and the totalitarian world as well, who are seeking to wipe out the Christian presence, to undermine the Christian ethos and ethical situation, to destroy the culture that's the way of Jesus. They will face the consequences of their actions in due time. That's a key emphasis. Those who attack and harry the people of God will face the consequences of their actions. All these people groups, history shows, were absorbed, conquered, or replaced. Only the people of Judah survived intact as an entity. Very interesting but powerful insight from history. God was working out His purposes. The question is, are we coming into line with Him? And that's the question for us today, as it was for the people of Judah then. They got things badly wrong. Their whole culture and everything else was corrupted from top to bottom. And they were not living the way reflecting the nature of Yahweh, the God who made the universe. There's a message for us today. Well, those who seek our downfall, or seeking our destruction, or seeking to wipe us out and our voice to be silenced and sidelined in the marketplace of Western life or wherever, they will face the consequence for actions, but we need to put our house in order. And we've got to ask ourselves questions in our groups, wherever we are. To what extent is what we do, how we behave, how we treat each other, how well does that reflect the way of Jesus. Deep challenges that come from this prophecy. Turning to Tyre, much longer. There's a kind of diatribe against Tyre, just taking it apart. Then there's a kind of lament. And then there's a message for the ruler of Tyre. And each section concludes with that sentence. The English translation, terrors I will send you, and you will cease to be forever. Actions have consequences. Looking at the first part, the 11th month, the 12th year, and the first day of the month, the word of the Lord came to me. There's a slight uncertainty about the Hebrew there. We remember that Ezekiel was writing under very difficult conditions as an exile in a foreign country. But it probably is the 3rd of February 585 BC, and that would be 1 month after the news of the fall of Jerusalem had reached Ezekiel. It fell in 586, but news took a long time to travel. Son of man, because Tyre has said of Jerusalem, aha, the gate of the nations is broken, and its doors are swung open to me. Now that she lies in the ruins, I will prosper, the land has been flattened. Therefore this is what the sovereign Lord says, I am against you, Tyre, and I will bring many nations against you, like the sea casting up its waves. They will destroy the walls of Tyre and pull down her towers. I will scrape away her rubble and make her a bare rock. Out in the sea she'll become a place to spread fishing nets, for I have spoken, declares the sovereign Lord. She'll become a plunder for the nations, and her settlements on the mainland will be ravaged by the sword. Then they will know that I am the Lord. Jerusalem, the powerful city, fell, and the leaders of Tyre in their island fortress, they rubbed their hands with glee. More opportunities for us to make money. Now many nations did attack Tyre. Nebuchadnezzar had a long campaign against them after the fall of Jerusalem. The city capitulated, but he never took it. It was an island city-state, and the weapons Nebuchadnezzar had couldn't reach. But it was finally destroyed by Alexander the Great 250 years later, and it's just an archaeological remnant today. A place of rubble and fishing nets. Beautifully restored, of course. For this is what the sovereign Lord says, from the north I am going to bring against Tyre Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, king of kings, with horses and chariots, with horsemen, a great army. He will ravage your settlements on the mainland. It was an island. Ravage them with the sword. He will set up siege works against you, build a ramp up to your walls, raise his shields against you. He will direct the blows of his battering rams against your walls, demolish your towers with his weapons, probably on the mainland. The horses will be so many they will cover you with dust. Your walls will be tremble at the noise of the war horses, wagons and chariots when he enters your gates, as men enter a city whose walls have been broken through. And the campaign on the mainland destroyed everything. The hooves of his horses will trample all your streets. He will kill your people with the sword, and your strong pillars will fall to the ground. They will plunder your wealth and loot your merchandise. They will break down your walls, demolish your fine houses, throw your stones, timber and rubber into the sea. I'll put an end to your noisy songs, and the music of your harps will be heard no more. I'll make you a bare rock, become a place to spread fishing nets. You will never be rebuilt. For I, the Lord, have spoken, declares the sovereign Lord. Now that was a long 13-year campaign, and it was tough on Nebuchadnezzar and his army. But all the settlements on the mainland, controlled by Tyre, were just reduced to rubble. And the island was isolated, its trade decimated, and eventually it capitulated in some way. There are records from the Babylonian records that the ruler of Tyre was paying money to Nebuchadnezzar as his overlord. Second stretch. This is what the sovereign Lord says to Tyre. Will not the coastlands tremble at the sound of your fall, when the wounded groan and the slaughter takes place in you? Then all the princes of the coast will step down from their thrones and lay aside their robes and take off their embroidered garments. Clothed with terror they will sit on the ground, trembling every moment, appalled at you. Then they will take up a lament concerning you and say, how are you destroyed, city of renown, people by men of the sea? You are a power in the seas, you and your citizens. You will put your terror on all who live there. Now the coastlands tremble on the days of your fall. The islands in the sea are terrified at your collapse. This is what the sovereign Lord says. When I make you a desolate city, like cities no longer inhabited, when I bring the ocean of depths over you and the vast waters cover you, then I will bring you down with those who go down to the pit, to the people of long ago. I will make you dwell in the earth below as in ancient ruins. Those who go down to the pit, and you will not return or take your place in the land of the living. I will bring you to a horrible end, and you will be no more. You will be sought, but you will never again be found, declares the sovereign Lord. An island with its harbours, ships trading. Nebuchadnezzar clipped its wings totally. And later, Alexander the Great wiped it out. Trading was a very powerful thing, and they traded in the dye purple particularly, very valuable. All over the Eastern Mediterranean. Great international impact. And the island city-states simply disappeared. Its power was broken by Nebuchadnezzar. It was physically wiped out by Alexander the Great. Vivid word pictures. Trading power, international influence. We all think that's wonderfully great. When it all falls apart, utter humiliation. Oh, we've got to watch in our Western ways of thinking that we haven't deified trade and the power of money. It starts with that. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, take up a lament concerning Tyre. Say to Tyre, situated at the gateway to the sea, merchant of peoples on many coasts, this is what the sovereign Lord says. It starts with Tyre saying, I am perfect in beauty. And it finishes by God saying, you've come to a horrible end and will be no more. And it is no more. If you take the original language and just put it, transliterate it into English, you say, I, consummation of loveliness. I'm perfect in beauty captures it well. Arrogance. Transliterated decadences, you become. Humiliation. Actions have consequences. And we deify the creation of wealth. We lose everything in the long run. Look in the first 11 verses of the whole chapter. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, say to the ruler of Tyre, this is what the sovereign Lord says. In the pride of your heart you say, I am a god. In the heart of the seas, an island city-state, impregnable. But you are a mere mortal and not a god, though you think you are as wise as a god. Are you wiser than Daniel? His reputation was already established. Is no secret hidden from you? By your wisdom and understanding you've gained wealth for yourself and amassed gold and silver in your treasuries. By your great skill in trading you have increased your wealth. Because of your wealth your heart has grown proud. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Because you think you are wise as a god, I am going to bring foreigners against you, the most ruthless of nations. They will draw their swords against your beauty and wisdom and pierce your shining splendor. They'll bring you down to the pit and you will die a violent death in the heart of the seas. Will you then say, I am a god in the presence of those who kill you? You will be but a mortal, not a god, in the hands of those who slay you. You will die the death of the uncircumcised at the hands of foreigners. I have spoken, declares the sovereign Lord. That's how the rulers of Tyre saw themselves. At that time it was a ruler called Ethbaal III. His name is translated Baal is with him, a Canaanite god. That's the danger, and it's still there for us today. Look at almost every leadership structure in our societies, anywhere in the world. They may start well, but enormous power and resources can easily cause the corruption, and they see themselves as above contradiction. They know the answers. They are superior. That's God's opinion of it all. In the end of the day, death faces us all, and we take nothing of what we've accumulated with us. Not even our reputation or our power. Uncircumcised, the Phoenicians, Tyre and Sidon were part of that. They also practiced circumcision, as many people groups at that time did. In the languages of the day, it's used metaphorically. And it just means an insulting term, meaning people outside their own community. They saw themselves as under their God. They were going to be overrun by foreigners. Nebuchadnezzar clipped their wings completely. Alexander the Great wiped them out. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, take up a lament concerning the king of Tyre, and say to him, this is what the sovereign Lord says. You are the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You are in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone adorns you. Carnelian, chrysolite and emerald, topaz, onyx and jasper, lapis lazuli, turquoise and beryl. Now the seal there, that's the signet ring that a ruler would wear. And the description follows the sheer wealth of the wearer. We're speaking of a human being here. That's how the original hearers would have understood it. Be cautious. In the Hebrew, Eden does not have a capital letter. It's just an ordinary Hebrew word. It's not a specific place. It's just a place of vast wealth and opulence. And the phrase the garden of God is a metaphor for some sort of utopian realm of prosperity and joy. Now Tyre, and its little city fortress on the island, quite a big island, depending on very valuable trade, the people were wealthy. They had accumulated enormous wealth and opulence. Their ruler had all that wealth. They seemed secure. Prosperity was all around. They were happy. But they were living selfishly at the expense of others. Ezekiel goes on, your settings and mountings were made of gold. On the day you were created they were prepared. You were anointed as a guardian cherub, for so I ordained you. You were on the holy mount of God. You walked among the fiery stones. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created, till wickedness was found in you. Now that's vivid poetic language. The ruler of Tyre is described in terms of living in a garden paradise, and that, from the historical records, is a very good picture of what Tyre was like at the time. But also being on a mountain, because it was a great hill mountain that just rose out of the sea. an island fortress, natural. But that's the picture that's given. That's what the original hearers would have got. The king is portrayed as God's appointee. He has to act responsibly in managing trade and wealth. If you like, looking after the garden. Not lining his own pocket at the expense of others. Now we've got to watch here. There's a danger in misinterpreting this passage. People have noticed that verse 1 refers to the ruler of Tyre. Now if you go back to older translations, it's translated as prince, which is a bit misleading. The word really means ruler. And then in verse 12, it refers to the king of Tyre. And people have argued, well, it's a different person. Now, in fact, if you look at Ezekiel, he always uses the word here that's translated king to refer to earthly kings. The word prince, the word there focuses on the function, ruling. And the word there focuses on the status, kingship. It's the same person. And you can see elsewhere in the Old Testament typical parallelism. He breaks the spirit of rulers. He is feared by the kings of the earth. These two bits are saying the same thing. And if you look at the whole chapter, the whole section, everything refers to trade, wealth and power. This chapter is about the ruler of Tyre, his function ruling, his status king. That's the primary meaning, the central meaning of what Ezekiel was saying, and that's how the original hearers would have got it. Through your widespread trade you were filled with violence, and you sinned. Power corrupts. So I drove you in disgrace from the mount of God. That's the island, mountainous fortress. And I expelled you, guardian cherub, from among the fiery stones. You thought it was completely impregnable. Your heart became proud on account of your beauty, and you corrupted your wisdom because of your splendor. So I threw you to the earth. I made a spectacle of you before kings. By your many sins and dishonest trade. We're talking about the ruler, the king of Tyre. You have desecrated your sanctuaries. So I made a fire come out from you, and it consumed you. And I reduced you to ashes on the ground in the sight of all who were watching. All the nations who knew you are appalled at you. You've come to a horrible end, and you'll be no more. All the cities and communities on the mainland opposite that derived their wealth from Tyre, they were all flattened and destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. That's what happened, and history shows it. And that's where it ended. There's a primary meaning, and this is how the original hearers would have got it. This whole chapter is speaking about the ruler of Tyre whose status was a king. And their history shows that they abused their power and wealth. And Ezekiel is revealing actions have consequences. God's coming to put it right. They've abused others. And underpinning it is that rulers, all rulers, rule by his permission. And when they go badly wrong, they face the consequences. God comes to put it right. And Ezekiel as a separate entity no longer exists. On a broader basis, that illustrates a deep principle. We humans were created to fulfill our role as the signet bearer. God has imparted something of His nature. He breathed into us. We're the gardeners to look after His world, His created world. We're His agents in this world. And looking after God's created world means looking after each other. The goal for every human being in God's plan is that we live for the benefit of others. We look after our planet for the benefit of others. And we have the imprimatur of God stamped, as it were, upon us. We're spiritual beings with freedom of decision. God has a plan. And if we align ourselves with His plan, we have the benefits of life to its fullness, whatever it may throw at us. But when we choose to go our own way and we abrogate power and status to ourselves, to our communities, to our system, we kind of see ourselves as gods. We're superior. Political stances can generate this. Religious stances can generate this. How many religious groups see themselves as superior to others? Nobody is superior. We're all God's children. There are consequences for actions, because if we abrogate power and status to ourselves, we damage others. We finish by leaving that. And it's a message for God's people today, as it is for all people in the world. God has a task for us. He's a long-term plan. When we move outside His plan in arrogance, thinking we know better, and when we abuse the powers that are given to us, actions have consequences, and they can be serious. The next presentation, we're going to look at empires, focusing on Egypt particularly, and God's purposes within that.